Have you ever wondered how an artist paints a commission, following a brief that a collector has set out for them to create a painting that's personal and unique and speaks to them? Follow along and I'll share my process with you. Part 1, Gathering Inspiration. I do this by asking my collector if there are paintings that I've already created that speak to them. This gives me a sense of what type of feeling they'd like to evoke in their space and what types of colors appeal to them. Sometimes they'll send me photographs of furniture, and often the room that the painting will be displayed in. Extras, like accessories, help me figure out what colors truly speak to them, and together we create a color palette that will be used for the painting. Once we've agreed on the size, the substrate, the color palette, and the timeline, I buy the materials and I get working. I always start by activating the surface. This is a very random process. I use water-soluble materials, graphite, pencil, crayon, and I just scribble with wild abandon, trying to cover up the white of that gessoed surface, in this case birch panels, with some colors and shapes that I can come back in and respond to later. After a first session, the surface will typically look something like this. A little bit of a landscape feel, don't you think? Now that the surface has been activated, this is when the fun really starts. This is what I call the intuitive painting phase, where I start to lay in blocks of color from that palette that we've agreed on, maybe in response to the shapes and the lines and the colors that are already on the surface, but maybe not. You'll see I'm working two panels side by side here. The collectors were interested in purchasing one, but I always like to work on multiples because I'm not quite sure what they're going to look like in the end. I never really know what the final product is going to look like as I'm in the process of painting it, and I like to give people a choice. Right now I'm treating the panels as if they're one. I find that kind of a fun way to move from one painting to the other. And a little further on in the process, I'll separate them and start to fine tune and hone in on how they differ from one another. I use a combination of paint straight out of the tube and mixing on my surface, as well as mixing on a Stay Wet palette. Often I'll go back in and add a little bit more scribbling at this phase, just so I can have some line work to respond to when I come back the next day. And at the end of this painting session, this is what the two panels looked like. I often add collage elements to my paintings. I really love painting handmade papers or using tissue papers that I've purchased online to add a little bit of whimsy and contrast to the work. You'll notice that these little red dots are very different in style than the brushstrokes and shapes that I've painted on the board. Here's where things get a little bit more thinky. So I've been painting very intuitively, not thinking too much about composition and contrast or value or shape. Now I need to do that to start teasing out the composition, to see what's there and to see what I need to enhance and refine to really create a painting. So you'll see this is the beginning of a session and then the end of the session on the same painting, and the beginning of the session on the second painting, and what it looked like at the end after I'd gone in and made some of those decisions. Now comes the most challenging part of the process for many painters, that is getting some feedback on what they've done. I use a variety of tools to help me see whether or not I'm on the right track. I like to turn my paintings into black and white to see what they look like. I like putting them in some art rooms apps, mocking them up to see what they might look like in a space. And then I like to do some drawing, sketching, to see whether there might be some changes to the composition that would benefit. Here's another little exercise I use. I will paint papers in solid colors and then stick them onto the surface of the painting to get a sense of what the painting might look like if I were to build it up. In this case, building up a bit more land and adding a bit of the heather colors of the Scottish Highlands, which are a big inspiration for this piece. At this point, my collectors have seen the paintings, they've seen those in situ photos, and they've given me some feedback on where we need to go to bring this project to its conclusion. That involves adding more paint, bringing the land up a little bit higher to meet the sky, accentuating that dark space in the top left-hand corner of one of the paintings. And at this point, it's really a lot of back and forth for me. I add paint, I take paint off. I let things dry. I go back in and add more paint, and I take paint off, and I let things dry. And I sit back a lot and just look at what the pieces are saying to me. So the previous session was spent mainly on what's looking like the land part of the paintings. Now that the paint is dried, I'm going to do the same thing with the sky. That is coming in and adding more layers, lots of sheer layers of paint. So I'm building up that texture and that story that the painting is telling, adding little bits of the sky colors down into the landscape itself so that your eye moves around and the paintings are harmonized. I'm still working on them together so that I can bring color from one painting over to the other. At some point in this session, I do move them apart. You'll see I also tilt them, rotate them 90 degrees, just so that I can get a better brush stroke in a particular part of the painting. And I'm working on them one at a time now, so I'm not distracted by the second painting as I make some final adjustments to the first. These are feeling fairly close to being finished. I'm going to let them dry. I'm going to come back to them tomorrow and see what else they need. So at this point, my collectors have seen both paintings. They've chosen their favorite, and we've talked a bit about what the final marks might be. For me, these are my signature marks. I go back in and add some dots and some lines and some scribbles. You can see that the collage paper is peeking through. You can see that those lines are making the landscape pop just a little bit, and the edges are painted a lovely gray lavender color. And here's the painting that's going to the Isle of Skye. I'm happy to say that my collectors are thrilled with it, and I can't wait to see it in their home.